Howdy folks, it's me, Josh. Throughout American history, 45 people have had the privilege of serving as President of the United States. And though there have been many contested elections throughout American history, there's rarely been cases of times where, by all accounts, someone should have been elected, but had that right stolen from them through shady backroom deals. However, that's exactly what happened in the 1876 election. An election so disputed, so controversial, and so contentious that it caused a constitutional crisis, nearly caused a civil war, and is still disputed to this very day. And allow me to introduce you to Samuel Tilden, America's stolen president. Before the election, the U.S. was under the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. And if I could summarize the Grant presidency in a single word, it would be corrupt. I can't go too far into specifics, but Grant's presidency was mired in corruption as bribes were passed left and right, officials were involved in corrupt rings profiting from government policies, and people essentially bought their way into government positions. And the thing is, everyone knew. The corruption in the administration led to massive scandals which tarnished the image of the Republican Party as corrupt. And to make things worse, a huge economic crash in 1873 left many people furious at the Grant administration for not doing enough to help. And all of this is to say, the Grant administration was extremely unpopular. Meanwhile, Grant had initially wanted to run for a third term, but due to this being a serious break from tradition, as well as worries that Grant being on the ticket would ensure a Republican defeat due to just how corrupt he was seen as, the Republicans convinced him to step down as they tried to find anyone else who wasn't seen as corrupt. The initial frontrunner for the Republican nomination was a man named James Blaine, a prominent House Republican from Maine, but due to some of his own corruption scandals, most Republicans pushed back against his nomination. And instead, they ended up selecting Rutherford B. Hayes, the governor of Ohio and a generally inoffensive candidate. However, that was exactly his biggest problem. He was too much of nothing. Nobody really knew who Hayes was outside of Ohio, and a historian at the time, Henry Adams, who was also a direct descendant of both John and John Quincy Adams, called Hayes, quote, a third-rate non-entity whose only recommendations are that he is obnoxious to no one. And so Hayes was really just a blank face for people to cast their image of the Republican Party onto, which, at this point, wasn't a good one. The Democrats, meanwhile, hadn't won the presidency since James Buchanan in 1856 before the Civil War. And in the 1872 election, they didn't even nominate a candidate, instead just endorsing liberal Republican Horace Greeley. But after Grant's image was tarnished by corruption and the economy crashed in 1873, the Democrats won big in the 1874 midterms, retaking the House of Representatives for the first time since the Civil War. So the Democrats saw this election as a major opportunity. If they could nominate the strongest candidate they had, someone who was seen as an anti-corruption reformer who could expose the Republican weakness, they would have a genuine shot at retaking the White House. And they would end up finding that man in Samuel Tilden, the governor of New York. Tilden was described as a small, fidgety man and was a lifelong Democrat from New York. He was anti-slavery and supported the Union during the Civil War, but greatly disapproved of Lincoln and helped George McClellan during the 1864 election. After the war, Tilden would, with the help of Tammany Hall, be elected governor, but realizing their corruption, prosecuted their infamous boss Tweed. Due to his tackling of corruption on this and several other cases, Tilden gained nationwide popularity as an anti-corruption reformer. And so, when the time came to nominate the Democratic Party's candidate for president in 1876, Tilden was decisively nominated, the most exciting candidate they had since Andrew Jackson. Tilden would strongly attack Republican corruption as well as Republican Reconstruction policies towards the South. Meanwhile, Hayes and the Republicans would wave the bloody shirt, trying desperately to tie Tilden and the Democrats to the Confederacy in hopes of damaging their image. The two would go back and forth until Election Day, on November 7th, 1876, with Tilden at every advantage and Hayes at every disadvantage. On election night, Tilden, once again, was the clear favorite as the returns showed that he was the winner. And so, everyone went to sleep that night knowing that Tilden was elected to be the 19th President of the United States, the first Democrat to be elected in 20 years. Until everyone woke up the next morning. The morning after the election, the country exploded. Tilden had secured 184 electoral votes, with 185 being needed to win. But it had come out that, across the South, Southern Democrats had intimidated black Republicans from voting and had even tricked some into voting Democrat by putting an image of Abraham Lincoln on the Democratic ballots, which Republicans claimed was voter fraud. You see, after the Civil War and the Confederacy was defeated and placed under Union occupation, numerous Northern Republicans, which the Southerners politely dubbed carpetbaggers, moved in and took control of the state governments. And though the carpetbaggers had been forced out of other southern states, at this point they were still in control of the governments of Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina. The initial results of the election showed Tilden winning in Florida and Louisiana, and with Hayes narrowly winning in South Carolina, which would have given the election to Tilden. But, since these states were controlled by Republicans, that meant that the returns boards of these states, which certified election results, were also controlled by Republicans and rejected thousands of Democrat ballots, giving Hayes each of these states, which the Democrats claimed was voter fraud. Meanwhile, all three of these states also had elections for governor going on at the same time. And as they rejected thousands of Democratic votes, this also flipped the results for the gubernatorial races, putting the Republican candidates for governor on top as well. Each Democrat candidate disputed the results of the election and set up their own rival governments, which each declared Tilden as the winner of their respective state. And in Florida in particular, the Florida Supreme Court overturned the Returns Board's declaration that the incumbent Republican governor, Marcellus Stearns, had won re-election, instead declaring Democrat Franklin Drew the winner. So, as a result of all of this chaos, this resulted in 3 states with 2 rival governments and 2 competing results for their elections. But, of course, it doesn't stop there. In Oregon, a state which Hayes had easily won, the Democrat governor, Lafayette Grover, said that since one of the Republican electors that was chosen, named John Watts, was a postmaster, he wasn't eligible to be an elector since the Constitution said, quote, "No person holding an office of trust or profit under the United States shall be appointed an elector." So, Grover would end up appointing his own Democrat elector who decided to cast his vote for Tilden. But, before the Electoral College was set to meet, Watts resigned his post as a postmaster. So, this resulted in a huge debate between Republicans and Democrats on whether electors were appointed on Election Day or at the meeting of the Electoral College. All of this resulted in a huge dispute between the Republicans and Democrats, both trying to find ways for their candidate to come out on top. And funny enough, since the Republicans controlled the governments of the disputed southern states, and since the Democrats controlled the House of Representatives, the parties ended up switching their stances from the Civil War on how to resolve the dispute, with Republicans arguing for states' rights and the Democrats arguing for federal authority. However, since the Republicans' ironic states' rights position would have meant that Grover was within his rights to replace Watts, the Republicans instead decided to say that the President pro tempore of the Senate, a Republican, had the right to resolve the dispute, while the Democrats argued that a joint session of Congress would resolve it, which was precedent. The Electoral College would end up meeting on December 6, 1876, and the winner still wasn't clearly decided. And so the country ended up entering into a constitutional crisis, which basically just means that nobody knew what the heck to do. Overall, the Democrats staunchly supported Tilden's case, while the Republicans weren't that optimistic about Hayes, as even Ulysses S. Grant and Hayes himself believed that Tilden had won. And things got so bad, in fact, that Tilden's supporters began to threaten violence if Tilden wasn't inaugurated, crying "Tilden or fight." And one day, while Hayes was sitting down to eat dinner in his Ohio home, a Tilden supporter shot into Hayes' home. At this point, the country seemed to be on the brink of civil war. Tilden urged his supporters not to resort to violence, but also began discussions to appoint George B. McClellan as his military assistant in case a civil war were to erupt. And Grant, worried that Tilden and his supporters might march on Washington, ordered a greater military presence in D.C. In order to resolve the dispute, the Democrats came up with the idea of creating an electoral commission which would decide the disputed votes. The commission would be made up of 15 members, 5 chosen by the House, 5 by the Senate, 4 pre-specified Supreme Court justices, and 1 Supreme Court justice chosen by the other 4. The Republicans initially fought back on the idea, with Hayes even calling it unconstitutional, but in the end, enough Republicans signed on and the commission was created. The commission was supposed to have 7 Republicans, 7 Democrats, and 1 independent. And when I say independent, I mean independent. The justice that was chosen by the other 4 justices was a man named David Davis, and it's been said that, quote, no one, not even Davis himself, knew which candidate he preferred. However, the Democrats would end up shooting themselves in the foot. The Democrat-controlled Illinois legislature decided to attempt to buy Davis's vote by appointing him to the Senate. But instead, Davis would resign from the commission in order to assume his post in the Senate. And since there were no other independent Supreme Court justices left, the commission was forced to select Justice Joseph Bradley, a Republican, in his place, giving Republicans an 8-7 majority. And so, when the commission met to decide on the victor of each of the disputed electoral votes, they ended up voting along party lines as Hayes won every single case, with him ending up winning the electoral vote 185 to 184, a margin of 1 vote, the closest result in American history. But if you thought the Democrats would give up there, you would be dead wrong. The Democrats were furious about this and came up with a plan to stop Hayes from being inaugurated. Before the electoral vote was to be certified, some Democrats attempted to stall the certification in hopes that it would prevent Hayes' inauguration. Since the commission meant that they weren't able to dispute the actually disputed votes, they decided to object to the vote count in Vermont, which Hayes had clearly won. But because the Democrats controlled the House, they were able to filibuster, which is to go on a long debate and stop a vote from taking place. In the end, though, the Republicans made a deal with the Democrats in order to end the filibuster. Ever since the Civil War, the South had been occupied by Union troops as part of the Republican Reconstruction Plan, which Southern Democrats were furious about. And so, the Republican leadership decided to make a deal known as the Compromise of 1877, in which, if the Democrats ended the filibuster and accepted Hayes as president, they would end the occupation of the South. This was an offer the Democrats couldn't refuse, and so they accepted as the electoral vote was certified and Hayes was to be inaugurated as the 19th President of the United States. This doesn't mean that the Democrats were happy about this, though. The House would go on to declare Tilden the duly elected president, but this didn't have any legal bearing. And some Democrats would try to convince Tilden to take the oath of office and challenge Hayes, but he refused. In the end, though, with his presidency seemingly having been stolen from him, Tilden would declare, quote, "I can retire to private life with the consciousness that I shall receive from posterity the credit of having been elected to the highest position in the gift of the people, without any of the cares and responsibilities of the office." Now, if you've watched many of my previous videos, this would normally be the part in which I set up an alternate timeline on if Tilden had become president. And initially, that was the plan for this video. But to be honest, a Tilden presidency wouldn't have really been all that consequential, nor would it have changed anything outside of a name and party on a timeline, and I don't want to leave you thinking a Tilden presidency would have been more consequential than Grover Cleveland's. Now, I could do an alternate history on if the election had sparked a civil war, which I might do someday. But not today. The election of Rutherford B. Hayes was probably one of the most controversial in American history and is even still disputed to this very day. And so, in the eyes of many, Samuel Tilden stays as America's stolen president. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, make sure to stick around for more. And hey, you could also, maybe, subscribe or something. So that's it for today's video. Well, till next time, see ya.